So I wanted to hit on something on your article because this is an interesting point that I think is worth discussing. So several of the categories you mentioned are relatively settled. Like there aren't going to be new entrants coming. And in fact, I really appreciated this quote when you talked about the companies that have tried, that the valley is littered with the corpses of startups who followed the siren song of market size only to have their backs broken by their only customer who walked away before the funding round closed. I thought that was so clever because you hear this, and this is why so many companies just dropped trying to even be a silicon startup. But in CPU, you've got Ampere. I don't know how many companies will come beyond them in CPU. There's nobody coming into GPU. All the remaining FPGA companies were purchased by Intel and AMD. The only one left standing is Lattice. I strongly doubt we're going to see a brand new FPGA company. So that leaves ASICs, accelerators, companion bits. That's sort of the opportunity, if you will, right? And just in this model, right, you looked at your market was you were saying ASICs networking at 10%. Is that word? Am I reading that right?
Yeah.
10%.
Roughly where it is today, yeah.
So it's not trivial, but it's also not gigantic, right? So you could essentially have a dozen or more companies fighting for a 10% part of a TAM, which again, not bad, but that's the only place, right? Am I interpreting that correctly? That's kind of the only place that we'll see new entrants, really.
So two things. One is I do think that heterogeneous compute in general shakes things up and opens doors in possibly unpredictable ways, right? Because if you're a hyperscaler and you're already moving from 100% Xeon to a whole mix of other things, the idea of now adding in some startup to test out because they have something really promising looks more appealing, right? Mm-hmm. Especially if you are, even in CPU, which seems pretty staid. If you come up with a CPU that has a particular extension to it, so a few extra cores to go after a particular task really, really well, mm-hmm. Hyperscaler might consider that, or especially if it's second or third generation and it's proven. Maybe they'll try that because it saves them 2% on something expensive. You can do that now because you have the capacity to explore these things, and you're not worried about angering Intel and losing your Xeon allocation. It's going to be hard to do that, but if you're a startup, getting even a small percentage of that market is doable. If you're a big chip company, I'm not going to name any, but if you're a big chip company, going after that is no one else is going to try and go after this market. You're not going to go after everybody's there already. So I think I think we will see new entrants go after this, and there is some. I think I concluded the article by saying it's hard. It's not impossible, but it's going to be hard.
Sure, expensive too.
So right. Some companies will try, and I think a few more will try. Some of them might actually succeed, and that's mostly what it is. I do think there is also the question of China, right? Every semiconductor conversation got to mention China. Because there are a dozen companies making CPUs and 36 companies making GPUs and 100 companies designing accelerators of different sorts. Some of those might be good. Like BREN actually had a pretty good GPU. Maybe geopolitics makes that impossible. Those companies can't get fabbed anymore, but they're out there. And we talk about 10 customers dominating this market. 3 of those are Chinese: Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. They're still really, really big Intel customers, and they're all they're very aware of what's going on in the world. So they're gonna try it out, and they're certainly going to try out domestic sources. So there's meaningful market there. It's just it's now complicated by the state of the world.
Yeah, and a part of the new entrant point is that there's startups, which, as you point out, is expensive and hard, not impossible. I mean, there are some really interesting RISC-V startups out there, which we'll talk about it at some point on a whole dedicated episode. But there again, they're focusing on accelerators, companion compute, not necessarily core compute. But I say the entrant point because I think this is an interesting part of the analysis to speculate where some big hyperscalers might try to go vertical, like the examples we've seen today from Graviton and Google's TPU, and Microsoft's done nothing. But I have to imagine that at some point in time, Microsoft does something. But to the same point, you would say, okay, well, what areas might they explore? It might be less attractive to do CPU. They're certainly not going to do GPU, but they might do a companion node or chip to a training module. Again, it's they have a lot of money, so they've got more, and they control the stack. But I think that's where I think it's interesting to say, well, where might they insert themselves? Back again to the kind of initial conversation, where do they see some of the most pain, underserved opportunities, or the most valuable workloads that they want to save themselves money on? Which again, I think Google, your example of Google's YouTube processor is a good one. It made sense to save them money, optimized a task, and it was an underserved solution for them. So that's why I sort of look at like where might they, again, we don't have to come to a conclusion, but I think that's an interesting way to frame that, which is, well, where might some of these companies insert themselves? Because to a degree, if you're a startup and you're like, hey, I'm going to go solve this problem, but then people might go vertical there. Not that don't do it, but it's a risk.
Yeah, it's a huge risk. I mean, all these companies are working on their own silicon. Who was it? I think it was sorry, Intel bought Habana.
Yep.
Because Habana had a design win at AWS.
Yep.
And the day that AWS publicly announced that they were going to have Habana instances, they also announced Trainium and Inferentia, their own internal chip.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that was, thank goodness the team at Habana had their exit, because that would have ruined them. I mean, that's how these companies break startups' backs, stuff like that.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I think
but it's interesting. What I was gonna say, but it's interesting though. You mentioned Microsoft. Like, what are they doing? Like, it's been like they've been rumored to be working on something for years now, and never quite done it. We all know they're working on something, probably many things, but they haven't quite really pulled the trigger for the most part. And same thing with Facebook. Like, Facebook's doing a lot of things too, but it's not entirely clear how much is their own, how much they're borrowing from others.
Right.
I wonder if at some point we're going to reach a limit. We're going to reach a limit to how much homegrown silicon there's going to be. We're still far, far away from that, but certainly looking back at GCT, NVIDIA's conference last month, Google and Microsoft were all over that. Like, Google, you'd think, can do plenty of AI silicon itself, but they're still really using a lot of NVIDIA.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I go back to the point of...
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just saying that's why I go back to the point of what is their pain and where does it make sense for them to solve a problem and have economic benefit versus just let somebody else do it. And part of this equation, and this is where I've always sort of just really struggled with the whole homegrown silicon part, is you got to ask yourself, again, unless your problem is absolutely unique, which to some degree I think your Google YouTube example is, unless it's super unique, what are you going to do better than NVIDIA, than Intel, than AMD, than name your vendor processor? And that's the challenge. Like, that's the one where, like, this conversation's coming up, to be honest with you, a whole nother subject again for future.